All right, ladies, back here on Inside Analysis. Ladies and gentlemen, Eric Kavanagh here, and our next guest is named Arshavir Blackwell. And we've just had a quick chit chat. This guy knows his stuff. He's been working with neural networks for a long time, since before they were called large language models. And we're going to talk about his book, The Creative Agency's Guide to AI. I think this is an excellent topic to put out there because everyone wants to use this stuff, but it is all generic. And I'll start off, Arshavir, just reminding our audience one of the things that is good to know about large language models is that they are largely consensus engines. So they're going to give you the average of what they've seen in a particular domain based upon their training and, of course, your prompt. And they are generative in nature. So one of the coolest things I just learned this maybe 4 or 5 months ago from a guest on the show. He told me that they are designed to not take the most likely next token because they want it to be interesting and dynamic. And so because if they did what was the most likely next token every time, it would all sound very similar and very vanilla and very milk toast, and that's not what you want. But that is why you have this tendency to kind of go off off the rails and hallucinate, as they're saying. It's not a hallucination. It's a confabulation, as one person put it to me, and it's just a function of how it's designed. But with that, Arshavir, tell us about your book, The Creative Agency's Guide to AI. Oh, what's it all about?
Sure. It's basically for creative agencies that are hearing a lot now about artificial intelligence and are kind of panicking and maybe have tried it to some extent, but don't really know exactly what the next steps are going to be or should be for what they're trying to do. And so, how do you choose a model? How do you set up a model that you can actually work on with your particular kind of ad copy? And it's actually very much tied in with an application that I'm working on called Your Voice Craft, which you can
Hmm.
see at yourvoicecraft.ai. So the two are kind of complementary to each other. And the idea with both the book and the application is that a lot of people are finding that what they're doing is they're using frontier models like ChatGPT or Claude or things like that, which are all very good models. I mean, don't get me wrong, I use them myself and they're incredibly powerful. But they're often finding that when they're trying to build ad copy, it comes back, unfortunately, with uh, very generic, general sounding kinds of texts. And I have a newsletter inside the blackbox.ai, and I'm actually doing a whole series of examples of that next week. But so I won't go too much into detail about that, except just to say it is, very often what you get back is very generic. The other problem you have is if you try to stuff too much creativity and too much kind of use this voice, use that voice into your prompt, you sometimes or actually very often get the exact opposite, which is something that almost sounds like a parody of what you're
Hmm.
trying to achieve. So ridiculous Southernisms if you're going for a Southern look, or ridiculous, if you want to try to do an Americana kind of style, it comes out just almost like someone trying to make fun of the whole
Hmm.
idea of doing that particular style. And so the one of the solutions to that I've been pursuing and that I think has been pretty successful is using what's called fine tuning. And that means giving the system examples not through the prompt and not instructions through the prompt, but rather actually training it after it's been trained on its basic kinds of information that, we all know that it's been trained on, training it on actual samples of the ad copy that you're trying to adopt the voice of. And the way that fine tuning works is it doesn't actually change the original model. It modifies kind of the weights around the
Hmm.
original model. So it's kind of like taking the original model and then doing a little bit of a transform on that. So you get something that's subtle but effective as opposed to overkill.
Hmm.
Now, there are a couple more advantages to this local model approach. One of them is that a lot of creative agencies are very, very concerned with security and with confidentiality of client materials. I've worked in a place where we did legal document analysis, and the security there was incredible. And so they don't want their ad copy or their raw material going out over the wire and potentially being used to train someone's frontier model or get
Yeah,
hacked into, or
right.
any one of a number of nightmare scenarios that we've all heard. I had a friend who worked at Sony, and they were, when they had that incident a few years ago, they were just hosed for months. So people are very aware that you have to be careful when you're
Mm,
dealing with online kinds of systems. And the local model resides completely on your own system. So the advantages are not just that you can fine tune your own local model, which you can't really do with a frontier model easily, but that also it's all completely local to your system. So you could literally just, if you chose to, air gap your system and make it so that you had a dedicated machine that does all of this ad copy um,
mm,
without ever touching anything in the cloud, online, or on the, at all. Um, so that's the basic idea. And then, kind of surrounding that is, I think we chatted a bit before about, my interests in figuring out how this stuff is actually kind of working.
right.
So those are kind of the two big things that I'm working on right now, or two and a half big things I'm working on right now.
Right. Well, so there has been discussion of small language models,
Yeah,
and I remember this is probably 2 years ago now, before I went to a Boomi conference. It's an integration vendor and automation vendor, and I was thinking to myself, this could be very, very interesting to have your own model in your
yeah,
data center. Let's say it's a small language model, for example. You train it or fine tune it as you suggest on all of your enterprise data or whatever you think is appropriate. And
right,
I mean everything from emails to business plans to documentation of policies and regulations and things like that. Whatever you've got, even call logs and any sort of security information or whatever it is you've got. You train on all that stuff. Then you set up Kafka topics from your main enterprise systems like CRM, ERP, for example, into this model or into a vector store next to it, basically. And what happens would be very, very interesting because now a senior executive could have what I call the executive cockpit, where he or she can ask any question about the business and get
right,
answers back like immediately. Because I had even asked the CEO of this one company, I said, "Hey, do you guys have FedEx as an account?" He goes, "I don't know." And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. Like, shouldn't the CEO be able to very quickly ascertain that by like clickety click, clicking in some, whether it's the sales system, if it's Salesforce or something else, that's one beast. But the
right.
nice thing about these language models is that they are so fluent in natural language. And so you
Yeah,
can ask it all these questions and that completely changes the game for how you manage your operation. So now
absolutely,
right
absolutely.
now you have meetings and you already know what's happening, so you can talk about what's going to happen next as opposed
Right.
to determining what's happening, which you already know, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Now, what you're talking about, they've done some, there's been some progress with frontier models and also local models using what's called retrieval augmented generation, which I'm
Hmm.
sure you know about.
Reg. Yep.
Now, that's a very powerful technique, and I've played around with it a little myself. The thing about it is, though, that you're still using the context entirely. So you're stuffing all of this stuff into the context, and it's basically the same as just
Right.
taking, a couple relevant documents and adding them into your prompt query and then sending them out. So
Right.
it's only going to take you so far. If you're able to do fine tuning on the data that you actually have in there, that's going to give you a much different kind of result. Now, it's possible that, RAG and fine tuning together will be the solution. I don't know. But another thing to keep in mind is that there are different kinds of ways to do fine tuning. So one way to do fine tuning is to basically subtly change the voice of what it is. So it's word choice, the way, it approaches a problem, the way it describes a problem. That's one kind of fine tuning you can do. You can also try to fine tune the actual information transformation part, the actual information retrieval part. And in terms of mechanistic interpretability, what we really don't know yet is if you do the one versus the other, what's actually going on inside the system and how is that going to affect the output? So are you going to want to do RAG plus fine tuning? Are you going to want to do fine tuning for some things and RAG for others? We don't really know yet. what's going on inside these systems well enough to figure out what the answers to those questions are. But
Right.
I think to your original point about small language models, it's absolutely the case. I think this is going to be the year that you're going to see small language models really begin to shine for
Hmm.
cost reasons, for security reasons, and just because a lot of them are just amazingly good and more than sufficient for what a lot of people want to use these models for.
Hmm.
So if you want to use the frontier model for some huge mega project that involves all sorts of different diverse sources of information, that's great. But if you have a very focused kind of project that just deals with your own company's internal documents, then that frontier model may not be what you really need to solve the problem ideally.
Right. Well, you think about some of the other old-fashioned AI models out there,
Yeah,
deterministic models that are used, for
right,
example, to decide whether or not to give someone a loan based on certain
right,
information, for example. And when I think about it, and maybe MCP is something to talk about here, model context protocol, which is the sort of the intermediary between your corporate data and your functionality that you have and the large
right.
language model, right? It's just kind of calling on different functions to do things. Maybe this is where MCP comes into play, but it seems to me that with most enterprise systems, there are only so many things you could do at a certain point in time. And
Hmm.
we're starting to see that mobile actually, I think, really helped us nail down workflows in this sense because the old-fashioned applications like Adobe Photoshop, for example, you would have 12 menu items and up to 500 options under each one, which is like, oh
Right,
my God, where do you even begin? Like you
right.
really have to study to learn how to use these things.
Yes,
But mobile, because you had such a small real estate in which to operate, I think it forced the UI designers to get serious and the workflow designers to say, hey, at this point in the process, there are only three things a person can do. Give them three options. Don't have all this real estate around with stuff. So my
right.
question to you is like the nexus of MCP and functionality in the enterprise that we want to leverage, are we getting further along the line of being able to really automate some fairly complex tasks and thus streamline business, even let's say in the ad agency business?
Well, so if you're talking about basically natural language as an interface, if I'm
Right.
following
Exactly.
what you're
That's
saying
right.
there. And I think we're seeing an awful lot of that. I think that the thing to keep in mind is how incredibly early we are in
Hmm.
this whole process. So the models are really remarkable, and what we're seeing people do with them are really remarkable. But the sort of general acceptance out in the population of people that aren't listening to AI podcasts every day like we are, those people don't, it hasn't really penetrated that. And I was actually surprised by this. I've read some articles on this, and you kind of live in this AI bubble, but then you see that, wow, out there in the rest of the universe, this is all still a very new and kind of, for some people, kind of scary thing. So, and very intelligent people are like, well, I don't really know too much about this, but I hear, something about data centers. I hear something about is it going to destroy humanity? So
Right.
that's what I know about it. So I,
So,
I think it's going to take a while for the general population to kind of be able to move over to a more sort of conversant natural language interface form of interaction.
hmm.
I mean, I just know so many people that kind of have heard of ChatGPT and maybe have used it to like look up the weather or something trivial like that. I mean, like the kind of thing you would do with Alexa.
Right.
But that really have never had like an extensive, long conversation with it and really been like, oh my God, this is like having a conversation with an intelligent human being. This is really kind of remarkable. I mean, Claude has a sense of humor.
Hmm.
And it's always kind of remarkable to me. I'll make some comment and it'll respond and I'll laugh out loud because I'm like, oh my God, it's not that I think that there's really like a person behind it or a
Right.
consciousness behind it. It's just that the technology is so remarkably advanced at this point.
Interesting.
But I think it's going to be a long time before the general acceptance of what you're talking about really comes to play because these things, look at how long from the very first website was like 1993, 1992, 1993 to, even in the year 2000, people were saying, oh, this internet thing is a fad, it's going to pass.
Right. Yeah. Right.
People try to
Right.
get onto it and it's not working for them and it's not worth the money. So we're going to see kind of jagged, I think, acceptance of it, jagged
That's
uptake of it.
That's a
Uh,
really good point, and that's a
yeah.
good segue to get to our next segment here. But folks, so we're talking to Arshavir Blackwell. His book is out, The Creative Agency's Guide to AI. Very good stuff. Don't touch it. I'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, talking to Arshavir Blackwell, author of this wonderful book. I really love this concept, The Creative Agency's Guide to AI. Generate content that sounds unmistakably like you. Useful stuff, but we do want to know how these things operate. I'm going to give you what a friend of mine, really smart guy, very forward-looking in AI, Lou Simon. He works for a company called Optima. He's the chief AI officer. And he had an excellent way of describing what AI is, because yes, it does hallucinate, as they say, so there are some credibility issues to worry about. But he said, look, it's an intelligence. So when someone comes into your office, you're not going to necessarily believe every single thing they tell you, but they have their own intelligence, their own knowledge base, and that's what this Gen AI stuff is like. It is an intelligence. Now you don't have to believe everything it says, but it will do a remarkable job at painting a very clear mosaic about any number of complex topics. And I've found it's very valuable in that sense because it gives you the sort of array of what to think about. And, one of my favorite expressions is man doesn't need to be taught so much as reminded. And I think that's where a lot of the value is going to come from AI. But what do you think about that characterization of Gen AI as an intelligence, just like a human has an intelligence?
Well, that's a huge question that I see all the time now being asked in the field. And there's a lot of question about, are these things really conscious? What is the first problem is we don't really have a good definition of intelligence, by which I
Right,
mean that there are people who have their own definitions of intelligence, but everybody seems to be different.
right.
And what I've kind of come to the conclusion of is we need definitions that give a multi-dimensional uh, representation of intelligence. So there's not just one intelligence, but it's on several axes because
Hmm.
you can say on the one hand, wow, Chat GPT can write a sonnet about quantum mechanics. That's pretty damn intelligent. But on
Right.
the other hand, a firefly or a fruit fly or, some little insect can do all sorts of really amazing things like a barrel roll that it can't do. So where does that leave you in comparing which one is more intelligent? And
Right.
so I think that basically what happens is people kind of choose the version of intelligence that maps onto what it is they're trying to prove or disprove about intelligence in LLMs. But I think what really we have to have a much more precise definition. And in the cognitive science field, there's, been quite a bit of work done in how do we actually measure different kinds of intelligences, multiple intelligences. But I haven't seen this discussion, unfortunately, seep into the philosophical discussions that I'm seeing around AI. So most of the philosophical discussions are either of the form of, oh, it's all just matrix multiplication, which, to which I say, well, your neurons are just doing electrical impulses too. So,
Right.
sure
Right.
that's really a response to, oh, it's my best friend and I know that it's alive. So, you have these two like just completely diametrically opposed views on it. And what I would say what we're trying to do with mechanistic interpretability is to not just look at the behavior of what the system is doing, because that's only a single evidentiary channel, but
Hmm.
rather to look at the mechanisms that are powering this system to do some of the really amazing things that it does.
Right.
And it's interesting. There was recently, I'm sure you've read this, there was a paper in Nature, I think it was published just last week, about how AGI is already here by four professors, UCSD, which is my alma mater. So, yeah, exactly. And so they gave a whole bunch of different reasons why certain criticisms of what AGI could or couldn't be were false.
Hmm.
And then they gave a whole bunch of reasons why AGI was already true. And my critique of it was really separate from that to a certain degree. My critique was they're just everything that they used in their examples was behavioral data. There was
Interesting.
nothing in that paper that discussed looking at the mechanisms inside the system and seeing, well, is this doing things that are brain-like? Is it clustering and responding to, is it creating categories that are kind of higher level the way we think that the brain operates? Or is it just doing a big fancy lookup table?
Right.
And it's interesting because the paper actually quoted or mentioned but didn't really address. There's a philosopher named Ned Block who came up with this sort of thought experiment and said, look, if you had this incredible system and it was able to respond to every single thing you said with an intelligent response, but it turned out to just be a huge lookup table, you would not consider that to be intelligent. You would consider
Mm.
it to be a big fancy lookup table. But without actually looking inside and seeing what it's doing, you don't really know whether it is a big lookup table or something more sophisticated and more complicated. And so to his point, that's why more than just behavior is important. You need to look at actually what the neurons are doing and what the systems are doing. And, incidentally, that's also important for issues like security. I mean, if we're going to be trusting these things with driving our cars and making health decisions for us and making analyzing legal documents and making summations and things like that, we really need to understand how it is that they're coming to these decisions.
Right.
And
Right.
we don't in quite a lot of cases, and we just kind of take it on faith that it seems to be working. But we need
Right.
to really address that issue, I think, much more because these things are going to be central to everything we do in, our daily lives.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, we'll have to probably pick this up for another show, but the part that fascinates me the most is how it seems to parse instructions. So, and that, I don't know if that's the front end, and there's also the credibility score. So, for example, if you ask it a question about current events or about something that is not trained inside the model, that's when it goes to the web and starts looking for things. And it will just grab snippets of text and then inject that into the prompt. And that's how you get its answer for what's
Right,
happening in the real world. Well, again, it's just reflecting back patterns of words. And when you get
right,
down to brass tacks, it's accepting a stream of text, which it vectorizes, and then it's doing some number crunching, and then basically outputting another stream of vectors, which gets converted to text. And that's all it's
right.
ever doing, right? Final thoughts from you.
Yes. Well, I would say my advisor, Elizabeth Bates, addressed that quite a bit when we discussed neural networks, even, way, way, way back in the day. And she would often say, how do you know that's not what humans are doing?
Yeah, right.
Why are you assuming that
Right.
there's some completely different mechanism? I mean, she wasn't saying that humans aren't conscious and don't have a lot of other properties that are really fascinating, but she was saying what you've just described could very well describe a great deal of human cognition as well.
Hmm.
And when we look at what neurons do, they're basically sort of very sophisticated, almost like logic gates, but biological. So I don't say that I know the answer to that because I don't think we do, but I don't think that dismissing what they do as being, matrix multiplication really is an answer simply because we don't really understand what we do as well. And it could
Right.
well be something very much like that.
Right. Well, I tell you, since these things came out, I've spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about myself and my own thought processes and
Yeah,
how I'm able to do things. And personally,
exactly.
I think AGI is, I mean, it's more of a religion than it is a scientific exploration, it seems to me. The danger is it's going to look like it's got intelligence, right? It's going to appear to
Yeah.
have intelligence because it's so good at reflecting back patterns of words, right?
Yeah. I think my theory on that is I think what's eventually going to happen is the AGI discussion is going to kind of get sidelined to, philosophers and other people like that. And the systems are going to be so good that people will just assume that they're conscious. And
Right.
I don't think there's going to be a real discussion around that. I think
Right.
it's just going to kind of be a fait accompli. And it'll be like, yeah, I don't know. What do I know? But it seems to be, so that's good enough for me.
Right.
And without anybody, I don't think someone's going to come along with rigorous proof one way or another anytime soon. So it's just going to become kind of another cultural phenomenon. That's
Yeah.
what I think.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting perspective. You're a real pragmatist. I'm
I
noticing
am.
you.
I'm very much a I'm a yes, absolutely. Mhm.
Yeah. Well, that's what reality requires, quite frankly. And I look at this stuff, and there are all of these warning signs of jobs. The job apocalypse they're talking about. There's some law firm in Chicago apparently that's firing 1,000 people because of
Right,
AI. But those jobs were, I mean, they were horribly tedious jobs that have
right,
now been optimized. So it's like in certain cases, I can understand why you would pare back your headcount, as they say. But in reality, what you need to be doing is focusing on learning how to use these technologies. And so, with that, I'll just remind folks again to look this gentleman up online, Arshavir Blackwell, and the book is called The Creative Agency's Guide to AI. Generate content that sounds unmistakably like you. Fascinating conversation. Thanks for your time, folks. We'll talk to you next time you're listening to Inside Analysis.